Hello and welcome to The Hated and the Dead with Tom Lehman. Today's episode looks once again at the European turn towards populism by looking at one of the continent's most entertaining but divisive politicians of the 21st century so far. Pim Fortuyn cannibalised the 2002 Dutch general election with his flamboyant campaign style and hostility to Islamic immigration. Both were highly novel in the Netherlands at the time. However, Fortuyn's star burnt brightly and briefly. 9 days before the election, he was assassinated by a left-wing animal rights activist. In a country with a political culture as gentle as the Netherlands, Fortuyn's murder sent shockwaves through the country. Pim Fortuyn is an important figure because he represents the transition between two political eras. From the immediate post-Cold War era of prosperity at home and peace abroad, to the post-9/11 politics of the 21st century, defined first and foremost by identity, insecurity, and polarisation. He was, in some ways, a politician from the future, but people just didn't know it at the time. Fortuyn was undeniably a very skilled debater and campaigner, and a funny person. I would encourage you all to watch his English language interview with veteran BBC reporter John Simpson. Even in his broken English, it's easy to see why the mainstream Dutch press and political establishment found him so difficult to grapple with. My guest for this conversation today is the Dutch journalist Guus Valk, who is the political editor of the Dutch language newspaper NRC. Guus recently released a 6-part Dutch language podcast about Fortuyn, so it's great to get his insights on him in English. The audio quality is a little below the normal standard today, so apologies for that, but it's still passable. As well as discussing Pim, Guus and I discussed the surprisingly common political journey from far left to anti-Islam right taken among Fortuyn's contemporaries, and the shape-shifting nature of the modern European far right. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to introduce Pim Fortuyn. Hi Guus, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well. It's a bit cooler in the UK today than it has been the last couple of days, which is a relief.
I heard you broke some records, yeah.
We did, in all the wrong ways. Guus, we're talking about Pim Fortuyn today. He's one of the better-known Dutch politicians of the sort of post-war era. And he's one of the only politicians from your country whose reputation has sort of travelled beyond the borders of the Netherlands. Though I'd say there's a sort of limit on that, actually. I've sort of done a poll of people recently, friends of mine, and they didn't know who he was. So, but he was born in 1948 in North Holland. What sort of childhood did Fortuyn have?
Well, the interesting thing about Pim Fortuyn is he is well known as kind of a flamboyant kind of character, right? He's the kind of person who would walk around side by side with his butler, 2 little dogs, wearing Italian suits, smoking big cigars. A very flamboyant lifestyle that he became famous for. But his background is very humble, so to speak. He grew up in some sort of Catholic, religious, Orthodox Catholic environment. He grew up really believing in God, Jesus, and also his mission was to become a pope one day. So his parents weren't that rich, I would say. So I would say that his background is very humble, very conservative. Something
that's quite intriguing about the young Fortuyn is that, to the extent that there was politics in his young adulthood, it was politics of the left. Can you just go into his sort of early politics a bit, and do we know where his sort of leftism came from?
Sure. Pim Fortuyn had the ambition to become a politician very early on, and always had this idea that he wanted to change the world, and he saw himself as being a leader. He didn't know what direction exactly, but he knew he was going to be a leader. Fortuyn, I think, has always had an instinct for the mood of the nation, I would say. So the moment he started going to university, first in Amsterdam, and later on he started to work in Groningen, a small town in the north of the Netherlands, where I actually also went to university. He immediately adopted the Marxist orthodoxy that was at that moment very, very fashionable in the academia. So he became a very fanatical Marxist. And the interesting thing about Pim Fortuyn is that he always knew from what direction the wind was blowing, but always was one step ahead of the curve, so to speak. So his Marxism was much more radical than the Marxism of his fellow students. And I've been working on a podcast series in the Netherlands called Pim. It's a 6-part series in which we investigate his background and the way he became the person he was in the end of his life. And one thing that really struck me was that in all ideologies that he adopted, from Marxism to right-wing nationalism, that was the core of his belief at the end of his life, he was always more radical than people around him, but he also had a very keen eye on what the people around him and what the public opinion was shifting to.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, he was a sociologist, I think, by training. That's what he studied at university. He was also gay. I don't know when he came out publicly. But did his sexuality, from the research that you've done for your podcast, do you think that his sexuality had much of an impact on his kind of early left politics? Obviously, he went to politics at the end of the 60s. This was the sort of post-68 era. It was the kind of birth of modern identity politics and modern LGBT politics, really. Do you think that his own identity played much of a role in his kind of analysis of politics and of the left?
Not directly, I think. It is actually the case that he came out at a very young age. He told his father that he was gay, and I think it was around his 18th birthday. And his father said, you can do two things. You can go see a psychiatrist, or you can just leave the house today. That was the way it was perceived in his conservative environment. He broke with the Catholic orthodoxy, although he stayed religious for the rest of his life, but he broke with the Catholic orthodoxy and found a welcome home in the academia, where people were, much more liberal when it came to who you are and who you want to be. But I think much more important is that it shaped his worldview, and it shaped his way of looking at mankind. And what I mean by that is that he had this idea that he adopted very early on, that he was some kind of other, and this otherness has always been his driving force. So he never felt at home in a political party, in his family, in friend circles, in the academia. He never found his home. He never found his place, and that was actually, that's of course a very sad story, but it also was in a way inspiring for him. It made him believe that he was some kind of special person who had a special kind of role in the world.
That's quite an interesting thing to set up, this idea that he sort of was always more radical than the people around him, that his kind of, if you like, his kind of political pendulum swung much greater extremes than other people, and also that he was a kind of outsider, because he ended up, I think, as a civil servant in the sort of 1980s, and the civil service, at least in the UK, and obviously I don't want to sort of impose what the civil service is like here to what it is in the Netherlands, but it's not seen as a place for kind of mavericks, really. It's seen as quite a conventional, to be a civil servant is to be kind of conventional, to be inherently quite conservative, quite cautious. That doesn't sound like Fortuyn.
No, but he was not a classical civil servant. So what he did was he was hired by the government to come up with some sort of government agency to do a project that was very, very difficult at the time, a very tough job he had to do, and it had to do with public transport for students. The government wanted to make it free for all students, and Pim Fortuyn had to do that job. And the way he did it, he was not a classical civil servant. He had always been much more like a businessman kind of person who hired and fired people as much as he liked. So he was very unconventional. He had conflicts with basically everybody, including his friends. But he got the job done in a way. And actually, the student card that we're still using today is an invention by Pim Fortuyn and is widely seen as one of his biggest successes, although it was in a very unconventional style.
Do you think that his time as a civil servant changed his view of politics very much? I've read that, or that some people have alleged that perhaps he became less identifiably left-wing over the period as a civil servant, certainly on kind of economic issues. Obviously, the cultural stuff kind of comes a bit later, but on economic issues, perhaps it made him moderate some of his former views.
Yeah, absolutely. He saw how and it was one of his big annoyances that the government is by nature a slow working environment where it's very hard to get things done. And his view on the business world and on the academia and on the way that the national government is working have been shifted in that sense. Absolutely. He also started to change the way he looked. So he cut off his long hair. He went on wearing suits and was sort of like a reinvention of himself. That also had to do with much more other things, by the way. Not only this student card project, but also the fact that he moved to Rotterdam. The second largest city of the Netherlands, a port city with a lot of problems when it comes to crime, prostitution, unemployment, people feeling unsafe, and so on. It made him already much more right-wing. But I would put him then in that particular time frame, not in any way in a sort of far-right place, but much more in some sort of more like conservative, maybe conservative liberal place. So he really believed in the way like businessmen can do, can make smart decisions. The things that you hear Donald Trump say sometimes. That's really Pim Fortuyn also. If we
keep moving forward with his sort of political transformation, then I think that there came a point, and I'm not exactly sure when this was, but it seems as if there was a point when. You've already sort of alluded to it, that economic issues as sort of salience and the importance of these issues began to sort of recede in his mind, and cultural issues started to come to the fore. And I think there was the influence particularly of one man, H.J. Shu, as a thinker on him. Can you explain a bit about what Shu, the sort of the mark that Shu left on Fortuyn as a thinker?
Well, it's a complex story, but let me put it very simple. When Pim Fortuyn moved to Rotterdam, he started seeing things in another light, and he, although he became some sort of like maybe sort of neoliberal in the early 90s. Really much of a believer in progress, also economic progress, but in a very liberal way. Maybe he was some sort of right-wing, third-way believer in that sense. A
libertarian, possibly?
In Yeah, but he has never been a full-blown libertarian, because he always believed in cooperation between government and companies. So that has always been some sort of a core belief of him. But some things changed in his life, and I think that those events have really shifted the way he looked at the world. So from a Marxist and then a neoliberal, he became some sort of a conservative Christian Democrat almost. So what happened was that he saw in Rotterdam the rise of immigrant neighborhoods. He saw crime-ridden communities, and also he started to be in touch with Hendrik Jan Schoo, who was at the time working for Elsevier, still is, by the way, a magazine that I would really put on the right. It's pretty much aligned to the VVD, to the ruling right-wing conservative party in the Netherlands. And he started to write columns for Elsevier. Every week he had a column. And those ideas, and Schoo has been always seen as a very conservative political commentator, have really changed the way he looked at things. He started to become more interested in Islam, for example, and in the way that immigration also changes the social fabric of a society. So he changed in that regard. And some friends that we interviewed for the podcast also point out that he made a very important trip to Indonesia, as you might know, a former colony of the Netherlands, where he had some sort of a holiday, and it struck him, and he never thought of this before, but it struck him that Indonesia had become a much more conservative Islamic society in his view. And he started to really focus much more on the cultural side of politics and less on the economic side, although he had his core beliefs about the economy.
How long has Islam actually been in the Netherlands? You mentioned obviously the fact that it had Indonesia as its kind of, jewel in its empire, a bit like India in the British Empire. Mm-hmm. But at this sort of time, was Islam still a fairly new religious phenomenon in the Netherlands?
Well, it has been present in the Netherlands for centuries, but what really changed was in post-World War II, there was a big influx of immigrant workers from mainly Morocco and Turkey. And they brought, of course, their religious beliefs with them. And that was actually the first time that you saw in Dutch society mosques being erected or neighborhoods that were predominantly Islamic. Before that, that wasn't really the case in the Netherlands. So it was a fairly new phenomenon, and it also has been very restricted to certain cities. Rotterdam has a fairly high percentage of the Islamic community, but there are also places in the Netherlands where it's hardly a thing. So it really depends on where you are, basically.
And what around this sort of time did Fortuyn start saying about Islam? What was he sort of advocating for in the kind of political sphere?
It wasn't really clear in the beginning what he actually wanted. So he was talking about problems, but he wasn't really giving any solutions whatsoever. But what you did see was that he changed the way he wrote about Islam, and he wrote hundreds of columns. You can still read them, and you can still easily see how he shifted to the right. Let me hold on. He wrote a book. It's called Tegen de Islamisering van onze cultuur, literally, and it means against the Islamization of our culture. He wrote it in 1997, and that was the time that he became really politically active, but he was really focused on the CDA, on the Christian Democratic Party, because he felt, and also in his books and his columns and his thinking, he really started to express feelings of regret about the way traditions were disappearing, how the family was disappearing, how churches were, emptier and emptier. He wanted some sort of social fabric back in society. So he started to become a Christian Democrat, basically. And in 1997, when he wrote this book, he took really stand against a religion, which is very uncommon among Christian Democrats, of course. He basically expressed feelings of well, I wouldn't say hatred, but it was much, much more radical than what he wrote before. And solutions weren't really there at the time. He's never been very, keen on solutions. The only time he really came up with solutions against what he called the Islamization of the Dutch culture was when he gave an interview when he was already very politically active in early 2002, in the last year of his life. At that time, he said that he literally said, er komt geen islamiet meer binnen, which means there is not a single Muslim ever coming to the Netherlands again. I'm not sure if that was a policy view or whatever it was, but that was one of the rare times that he really had a plan instead of just talk.
I'm interested to see how his sort of political career took off, because obviously what we've discussed so far is a series of sort of pronouncements and changes of political opinion, which are not always, it's not always entirely clear why they've happened, right? But it's not really a sort of political career. But he did end up becoming an actual politician rather than just a sort of sideline commentator, an armchair commentator on various issues in Dutch politics. When did he sort of first dip his toe into politics, and when do you think he sort of became a kind of household name?
Well, he tried many times. He started with the Social Democrats in the early 80s, was rejected there. They hated him actually over there. Then he moved over to the Christian Democrats. He started with the liberal conservatives, but he never found his home. And it was basically just getting to know each other and then finding out that it was impossible to have Pim Fortuyn at your party. Remember, these are all very old, very classically organized political parties where basically have to use your elbows for 20 years if you want to make it. And they don't like people like Pim Fortuyn who just come in and want to change things the way they want to see it. That's very uncommon in Dutch politics. So he had a lot of basically failed romances with the political parties that were already there. And it was only in 2001, after 9/11, that he really started to tip his toe into politics. He actually announced just before 9/11, I think it was August 2001, on national television that he was going to run for office and to come up with a political party. But that was seen as a joke at the time. People weren't really taking that seriously. After 9/11, he used his podium, for example, his column in Elsevier, but also he also was a household name on television, to basically work on his political platform and to show what he was actually trying to do. So after 2001, after 9/11, it went really, really fast. So what he did was he announced his candidacy, but he had no party. He was basically a loner with an mission. At the time, there was a new political party coming up in the Netherlands that had high expectations, called Leefbaar Nederland. I think if you translate literally, it would mean livable Netherlands. And that was a party without a leader. So there was a very well-organized group of people that wanted to change the way Dutch politics worked. It was populist, a little bit more to the left than to the right, I would say, but definitely a populist party. And they were looking for a leader, somebody who could be the face of this new movement that came from all kinds of local parties everywhere in the Netherlands. all local parties who were very, who represented very dissatisfied voters who had no way to go to. Because remember, we have never had a tradition of far-right or populist parties in the Netherlands. So there has always been a black hole, if you will. So what happened was that Pim Fortuyn and this party, Livable Netherlands, found each other. And Pim Fortuyn became the head of this party, and they knew next year is going to be an election year. We have our leader. So Pim Fortuyn at the time, all of a sudden, got this great, this great gift because he got this wonderfully organized party just thrown in his lap, basically.
I want to discuss a bit more closely the Dutch politics of that period, especially with regards to Islam. Was Fortuyn's analysis at this stage especially about Islam, was it sort of commensurate with the politics of that time already? That's to say, do you think Islam was already a large political issue before him, or was this something that you can sort of attribute definitely to him, that he sort of put this on the map? It sounds as if, from what you've said a second ago, that the September 11th attacks had a very big impact on Dutch politics, especially in this regard.
Well, yeah, before that, Islam was not an issue at all. Actually, it was seen as racist and fascist to even be willing to discuss the downside of immigration from people from Islamic countries, for example. So that was absolutely a big taboo, and also politically, it was not an issue at all. So there was an extremely small far-right party at the time that they called themselves the Center Party, but were actually to the far right. And the Center Party addressed these issues, but was seen as very fringe and had a very uncharismatic leader. The other parties had no interest in discussing this at all. And the government at the time, they called it themselves the Purple Government. It was a very unusual combination of two liberal parties and one social democrat party. And they found each other in a very neoliberal, technocratic way of governing, which meant that the state was a company, basically, that ran the country as a company and made a big profit at the time because the economy was doing very well. So everything that was about cultural issues, that was about people not being pleased about the way things were going, that was basically not an issue at all in the Netherlands. So although the overall satisfaction rates were pretty high and crime rates were pretty low at the time, there was a growing sense of discomfort in the nation. And the traditional political parties were not able to address this, also because there was no real opposition. Basically, everybody agreed at the time. Remember that this is the post-Cold War era, and basically most political parties thought that all ideologies had gone, basically.
Yeah. People thought the right had sort of triumphed on the economy and the left had triumphed on social issues, right?
Yeah.
I just sort of want to think about Fortuyn's analysis on Islam a bit, and obviously we've covered his sort of political transformation from Marxist to sort of Islamo-skeptic, hard right politician. That's actually, in European politics, it's a more well-trodden path than some people might realise. And in Italy, you had people like Oriana Fallaci, who had been a sort of anti-fascist under Mussolini, and then wrote this very famous polemical essay about Islam after 9/11 called "The Rage and the Pride," which caused a lot of controversy in Italy. In Britain, you have people like Christopher Hitchens, who, like Fortuyn, was a Marxist in his youth and then became very hostile towards Islam in his later life. How do you explain this journey that lots of post-68 leftists underwent, where they ended up being so anti-Islam, and not just anti-Islam that it was kind of one issue among many for them. It actually became the kind of driving issue for them.
Because many of this 68 generation that Pim Fortuyn was also part of believed in extreme tolerance, and tolerance was the way that fascism, neo-fascism, would be defeated. And especially the Social Democrats have believed for a long time that the right thing to do was to tolerate intolerant elements in society. So Islam criticism was just not a thing. And somebody like there are many people who became disappointed in the way that the political parties of the time were dealing with this issue, because, for example, the Social Democrats, who had strong roots in immigrant society, by the way, used, for example, mosques and the religious infrastructure of these immigrant communities to get a foothold in those communities. And the effect of that was that they actually promoted some sort of conservatism, not necessarily that they wanted it, but that just happened, right? And I think some of the more disappointed in the 68 generation have maybe they lost their hope when they saw that happen. I'm not sure if this really counts for Pim Fortuyn, but it's definitely something that I see happen a lot in the 68ers.
If we move to the 2002 election, this was Fortuyn's election. It was, he was a politician by this stage. What sort of a campaigner was he? How would you describe his, political style when he was sort of up on the soapbox as well? I'm always tempted to compare him, in my mind anyway, to Nigel Farage, the British politician, mostly because of the kind of suits he wore. There's a sense of flamboyance, a kind of tongue-in-cheek element to a lot of the campaigning and speeching that they did.
Yeah. His campaign was extremely short, but he came in like some sort of a comet from outer space, with great sense of humor. He's very eloquent. He was extremely outspoken on issues. He was exactly what the ruling political leaders of the time were not. They were all used to their own technocratic lingo, and what you do in Dutch politics is create coalitions always, because you need each other, right? There's no political party with big majority whatsoever, so you need each other. So what you do when you campaign is always, of course, you point out a few differences, but you always make sure that the voter understands that we're all in this together. We're coalition makers. And we believe in the polar model, as we call it, right? The model where everybody gets their seat on the table, everybody gets to talk, and in the end we work out some sort of great compromise. Fortuyn was exactly not that. He was very confrontational. He was extremely funny. There is a television debate that is historical. You can find it on YouTube. On March 6, 2002, after the municipality elections in Rotterdam, that he won by a landslide. I think he got more than 33% of the votes. And he had, at the end of the night, I think it was already after midnight, he had this television debate with the other political leaders. And they were all completely worn out. They were completely disillusioned. And they were sitting in their seats, grumpy, old, gray, and he was having a blast. So he started to insult everybody, but in a very funny way. And, he said, like, for example, cheer up, people, these kind of things. He disqualified the whole ruling political class at the time because he was, whatever you think of his ideas, he was a fresh newcomer. And he had a great time. And he was a very, very good communicator. He was really able to communicate emotions. So he got upset. He walked away from interviews, from debates, TV debates, things that politicians never do. But he showed his emotions. talked openly about his sex life during the campaign and was very comfortable with that. And the other politicians all of a sudden didn't play a part anymore, it seemed.
They just didn't know how to deal with him.
No, and nobody was listening to them anymore. So it was for them very hard to, because the only language they spoke was the language of the 90s, where the government wasn't some sort of place where you debate ideas. It was a place where you run a country, and they were not prepared for the post 9/11 era, where all of a sudden it was all about ideas, because Western society was under attack, and Western society had to deal with the disillusionment of the end of history, because the end of history turned out not to be an end at all, of course.
Did he sort of catch on, particularly during this election campaign, sort of early on? Obviously, we'll talk in a second about the event that for which that election is known. Mm-hmm. But was he sort of rising in the polls?
He was rising very steadily, but he got obviously he got a lot of criticism. So his opponents were waiting for a chance to bash him. So for example, when he gave an interview in the Volkskrant, the national newspaper, where he said that he wanted to close the border for Muslims, that was the moment that political parties understood, like, okay, now we can act. Now we can show that he is, in fact, some sort of, fascist or racist. So one of the leaders of P66, of course, the Social Liberal Party, started to read from the diary of Anne Frank, for example. Another one said, "Holland, wake up." These kind of words. This is extreme right, said one. This is not far right anymore. After his assassination, of course, a big debate started about, is he, so to speak, demonized? There's a lot to say about that, but first of all, I want to say that the debate from both sides started to become very heated. But he won in the polls every week. Remember, I was a very young political journalist at the time. Every week he started to win 1 or 2 seats in the polls, and that was a very, very steady rise. And you could see that he was actually on his path to become the biggest party, or maybe the second largest, but to become a big success.
And then, of course, comes the events of the 6th of May.
Mm-hmm.
Can you explain what happened?
So it was, I think it was 9 days before the national election, and he gave an interview to Dutch Public Radio, and after that interview in Hilversum, where the studios are, he walked out of the studio, walked to his car with his driver, and all of a sudden there was a man standing there, an animal activist actually, who shot him 6 times, and the guy ran away but was caught, and Pim Fortuyn was almost immediately killed on the spot. That moment has become one of the biggest political traumas that the Netherlands have ever experienced, because political violence has always been an absolute no-go in the Netherlands, and all of a sudden it was there. It was very much there. What made it extremely tense at the time was that it became very late in the evening clear who the assassin was. So there were all kinds of theories, like, what if it's an immigrant, who was fed up with all the anti-immigrant rhetoric, or what will happen to the nation if something like that happens. All of a sudden it turned out to be basically a loner himself, Volker van der Graaf, who had just one cause, and that was animal activism.
Was he? We often end up talking in the aftermath of sort of terrorist attacks and school shootings in the USA now about mental illness. Do we know whether de Graaf was mentally unwell or sort of unhinged?
Yeah, I know that it was investigated at the time, but that has never been really clear. he didn't really feel sorry for what he did. He thought that it had to be done, basically. But he has never really given an explanation on why this actually happened.
This was obviously very close to the election, I think only a matter of days.
Yeah.
What happened to Fortuyn's party? How did it end up doing in the elections?
Well, to catch up with the story, he was the leader of a very well-functioning political party, Livable Netherlands. But after this infamous Volkskrant interview, he was kicked out. And he had only a few weeks to come up with his own party, and he did. He started his own party called the List Pim Fortuyn, and he found some people that he put on the list. Some of them were good friends, some he didn't really know. The number two just rang his doorbell one day, and he kind of liked the guy and said, "Hey, do you want to be my running mate?" So it was clear that after the assassination, this party was going nowhere. But they did win a respectable number of seats at the time. So they became the second largest party. The Christian Democrats won, probably because people were very dissatisfied with the way the Purple government was dealing with this whole issue. So the Christian Democrats won, but the Lijst Pim Fortuyn became the second largest party and was actually able to form a government with the conservatives and the Christian Democrats. That only lasted for 87 days because it has become the most burlesque period in Dutch politics, I think. All of a sudden we had, I think it was 24 members of parliament who had no clue what was going on. Really, they were fighting each other. They were making all the rookie mistakes that people just make when and nobody helped them. So this party was going nowhere. That was clear. So in the elections a year later, they lost almost all their seats, and the election after that, they just disappeared.
So did it do better as a result of Fortuyn's assassination? Better than it was expected it would do?
Well, polls were not clear. I think.
I suppose because it was such a new party, it was difficult to tell, right?
Exactly, and the common opinion was that it was probably an underpolled party because people were kind of like ashamed of admitting that they were voting for Pim Fortuyn. After the assassination, there were a lot of sympathy votes for Fortuyn. So they would probably, if Pim Fortuyn was still alive, most pollers are saying that he also would have probably around 25 seats. But it's just a wild guess. Nobody really knows.
Sure.
But he was clearly he clearly had momentum, and if he wouldn't have won, he would have become the second largest. That's for sure.
A lot of the stuff that you've mentioned today, the sort of flamboyance, the populism, the jokey nature to Fortuyn as a character, instinctively that sounds much more like the politics of 2022 than it does 2002. You indeed actually have a sort of anti-Islam populist politician in the Netherlands now, Geert Wilders, heads the Party for Freedom, also came second in the general election in 2017. Fortuyn, in that sense, clearly struck a chord and was kind of ahead of his time. Are you living in Pim Fortuyn's Netherlands, Guus, in 2022?
In a way, yes. I think you can still. I work in The Hague as I'm now the bureau chief of the political desk of my newspaper, NRC, and I think you can definitely see that many politicians have adopted the thinking of Fortuyn or the flamboyant style of Fortuyn. Think about Geert Wilders, maybe not even so much because he has become very predictable in a way, but think of Thierry Baudet, for example, who is leading the far-right party Forum for Democracy. In his in his flamboyant lifestyle, he really looks a lot like Fortuyn. And voters were not so into it before Fortuyn, but have become used to politicians who have this larger-than-life kind of charisma. And that is, of course, a very international thing, and I don't really need to explain that to you and people from the UK who are listening. But it's that is, of course, an international phenomenon. He was not ahead of the curve when it comes to Islam criticism. I think we were just very late in the Netherlands because Austria, France, Italy, they all had their populists already who were extremely successful, and Belgium also. In the Netherlands, there was this this blanket of, in a way, political correctness. I don't mean that word ironically. It was political correctness. Yeah. Of not mentioning cultural issues, let alone Islam, migration, for example.
Anti-Islam politics is very significant in Europe today. Do you have much, as somebody who comes from the Netherlands, lives in the Netherlands, but sort of has a wider knowledge and I assume has visited quite a lot of Europe, do you have a much sense of the quality of relations between Muslims and non-Muslims in your country compared to such, equivalent relationships in other countries? How hostile is the relationship between these groups in relation to your neighbours, France, Belgium, Germany, the UK?
That's a tough one. I think Geert Wilders is addressing this issue of anti-Muslim rhetoric, but I think it comes in waves, right? So in politics, but also in society, I don't see it right now as the number one cultural issue on the right at all. I think the focus has really shifted from Islam to what I would say like the political elites or other enemies who are there. So Islam is still Wilders' thing, and in some communities in for example Rotterdam, that is also clearly still going on. But anti-Muslim hatred is very rare in the Netherlands, I would say, if I can generalize. So and also even other far right parties, like for example Thierry Baudet, hardly ever mention Islam. That's very interesting. They mention the World Economic Forum or Klaus Schwab much more than they mention Islam. Actually, Baudet stated once that Islam is not our enemy. So it's hard to say that anti-Islamism is still the oil that keeps the engine running on the far right. Yeah. I don't think that's really the case.
There's certainly been a proliferation of issues in the UK, and I wouldn't say Islam is particularly it's not really a topical issue in politics here either. I'd say in the leadership election that we have now, I'd say the lockdowns and probably transgender rights have been much more significant as kind of culture war issues. There's a feeling that much of this sort of right-wing populist politics that we have in Europe today kind of arose as a result of the financial crisis in 2008. That it's quite a recent phenomenon. But actually, do you think that that's erroneous, this idea of it being recent? Because obviously, Fortuyn, Jean-Marie Le Pen in France, the Freedom Party in Austria, these were all things that predated 2008. These are actually quite old political phenomena. And I guess this idea of far-right politics having a resurgence, for it to have had a resurgence since 2008, it requires it to have gone away at some point, right? For something to have a resurgence, it needs to have gone away first. Do you think that far-right politics ever actually went away in Europe?
No, they didn't. They changed their agenda, but they didn't go away. And they were, in the post-08 era, very smart in adopting left-wing ideas into far-right ideology. So, for example, being against the banks, being against Wall Street, being against elitism, globalism. That was pretty much a left-wing thing to do and to say. That wasn't really a far-right thing at all. But they have become very smart in rebranding themselves. Islam was really the main issue between 2001 and 2008, I would say. I think the financial crisis has shifted that a little bit, and now I speak only for the Netherlands, and has made it much more about elitism and much less Islam. But it's an interesting thing to study. What was that shift exactly? It's also a guess for me. It's something that I see happen, but it's something that I have clear answers to.
I suppose the follow-up from that question is, do you think that far-right politics is getting worse? You know, when you look at sort of 20 or 30 years into the future, and you can set your answer on your own terms, whether it's just for the Netherlands or for Europe as a sort of whole, are you optimistic about a sort of more conciliatory politics and a more conciliatory relationship between the sort of white Christian population of your country, or of mine, or of Europe in general, and Muslims that live here, and that that absolutely. There's all signs of that has become, no reasonable human being wants to expel hundreds of thousands of people who are actually here, are Dutch, are making a living here, are going to school here. That is not an issue at all, I would say, only for a very, very small fringe. But I'm not at all optimistic about the far right itself, because the far right has been, and the roots of that I saw in the US, where I was a correspondent for 7 years until mid-2018. So I saw the rise of Trumpism over there, and waves of that, landing in Europe. But the total rejection of democratic institutions and the democratic rules of play are extremely worrying, I think. And Pim Fortuyn, in his way, was maybe a far right politician, but he never rejected, the way democracy works, for example. That was just not at all his message. So I see the far right shifting to and basically breaking off from the rest of the pack, and that's extremely worrying to me. Guus, thank you very much. That was great. If people want to find more of the stuff that you've written or said about Fortuyn, or just read you on a sort of regular basis, obviously you work for a Dutch language newspaper. Do you do much in English?
Well, I mainly write in Dutch, to be honest. When I was a correspondent, I had my articles translated sometimes, and it was always fun, because all of a sudden you get Americans reading what I was all writing about America. But that has become very, very rare. And I'm sorry, but my 6-part podcast, Pim, that anybody can find on Spotify or other platforms, is also very much in Dutch. So I'm sorry.
Well, this is maybe this is the start of something new for you. Guus, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to The Hated and the Dead. If you've enjoyed this podcast, follow it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and, for good measure, leave us a review. You can also follow The Hated and the Dead on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, so you never miss new content.